Here is Sailor Studio 931, and I'm calling this a magenta because of what looks like the base tone you can see in the chromatography, but it does in the writing sample darken to a burgundy just like the swatch. We get the slightest amount of tone shift as paper changes. It generally shades really well from a magenta to a burgundy. It is very aggressive on non-fountain pen friendly paper, getting very deep into the page. However, I don't see any feathering in the writing sample. This is a very interesting magenta in how it shades, and I think this is a perfect alternative to a classic red that while I'll pass on it, that is, I did enjoy using it. It's been a great ink. I just don't see a need myself for a bottle.
The pen for today is a Pilot 100th Anniversary Benzi 10. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
We can see that the tones stand out really well against this bright white paper, showing off the magentas and the burgundies. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it shades incredibly well, which is a really good thing if you were using this as an alternative to red, because reds, many times in my experience, don't shade a ton if they do. But just take a look at integers on the second line, where the N is a little bit lighter than the TEG, that gets quite a bit darker. The ER lightens up a bit, and the S at the end becomes much darker again. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Sailor makes more than one ink, so let's take a look at a few other inks from Sailor.
Here is Sailor Chamoya. Here is Sailor Bungu Box Melancholic Gray.
Here is Sailor Studio 670. Here is Sailor Studio 023.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we get a tone that is noticeably lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, barely shades in this case. Really just always looking like a lighter magenta in what's going on. Almost faded, but I wouldn't call it a faded magenta. Nice, pleasant tone, and more along the lines of what I tend to expect with reddish inks. Looking at the back of the page, you can see how aggressive this ink is with how deep it regularly gets in all the way through all of the writing, meaning you could not write on the back of the page. However, nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we can see that we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine, or maybe a little bit darker, only because of what we get to see from the shading in the Clairfontaine. Now, it doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It more looks burgundy as a regular than it does a magenta. So I get much more burgundy here, very little shading. The more burgundy makes me feel that it's being altered in tone by the tone of the paper, meaning the ink itself is a little translucent. Looking at the back of the page, there's only a couple spots that I can see that it got a little bit deeper into the paper. These would not stop the writing on the back of the page to me. The ghosting is really minor. I don't believe that it would be any kind of a problem if you did write on the back of the page. So this, while it can be aggressive, does very well here. Oh, and nothing bled through to touch the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we can see we've got the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade almost as well as it does on the Clairefontaine. An example of that would be in example on the third line, where the EX is a little bit darker than the AM. The P slightly darkens again. LE at the end does get much darker. It stands out against the quad rule without any kind of a problem, making the quad rule blend or disappear into the background, making this a great ink if this is the type of paper you prefer. Looking at the back of the page, we can find a few spots that the ink got quite deep into the paper. It never bled through touching the page underneath, but this is a warning sign about the aggressiveness of this ink. Do I think you could continue writing your notes back here? Yes. Just take this warning sign for what it is.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more magenta inks.
Here is Califolio Maroon. Here is Noodler's Omaha. Here is Robert Oster Copper.
Here is Vinta Macopa.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we can see a tone that is noticeably lighter, noticeably flatter than it was on the Clairefontaine. No feathering, no spread, almost nothing for shading. You have to go looking for it. So it's not a big deal. I think the tone we're getting here is really pleasant, really interesting. If you're a student using this, I think you're still going fine. It looks good. It stands out against the quad rule. I'm going to go ahead and give you a check plus for this. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Cross Blue Black. Here is Diatramentis Fog Gray. Here is J. Herban Amber de Bermini. Here is Jinhao Black.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we can see that the tone certainly is lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine, but not hugely lighter, just a little bit lighter, and really showing off that magenta of what's going on. It does not feather, it barely spreads at all, it almost doesn't shade. You can find a couple of spots, but it barely does it. So that's not the thing. The thing here is it performs very well with this paper, meaning if you regularly write on inexpensive paper, then perhaps that Hammermill 20-pound is the way to go. Looking at the back of the page, we can definitely find spots where it got deeper into the paper, but it never bled through touching the page underneath. Plus, considering that this is copy paper, I'm going to say what's happening here is really minimal and great performance for this ink on this paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Pilot Benzi 10 has a medium flow, medium nib. It gives a nice magenta shading to burgundy red. Off camera, I tried this in a dry stub, and it had no effect at all on the performance, tone, or shading in this ink. That makes this a dealer's choice, as it doesn't matter the pen you use, just be aware of the paper itself. So ink your favorite pen and enjoy.